have a few questions.
Speaker, please. Thank you.
Ms. Reid, I have a few questions for you now. Yesterday, one of the things that you discussed was the need to develop and strengthen partnerships and to engage in watershed level planning. And I'd like to ask you a little more about that and draw your attention to a specific example that you might be aware of. So, Mr. Bissett, if you could please bring up tab 1 from our list. And this is a newsletter from the year 2000 from the Fraser Basin Panel, or Fraser Basin Council rather. It's a special report from the spring of 2000 on Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal partnerships. Now, Ms. Reid, I'm assuming that you're aware of the work of the Fraser Basin Council because we note that it's listed as one of the cooperative processes that were on your inventory. Do you recognize, are you aware of the work of the council?
Yes.
Now, if we could just turn to page 4 of that document, please. And at the top of the page, it says Nicola Valley Watershed Stewardship and Fisheries Authority. Have you, first of all, I'll ask you, are you aware of this authority?
Yes, I am.
And what's stated here in the report is that this organization, or this authority, I'll call it, is described as one of the leading partnerships for fisheries management in the Fraser Basin. It goes on to say that they're funded by Fisheries and Oceans through AFS. They undertake stock assessment, stock enhancement, habitat restoration, that they've built and now maintained records of what they describe as unprecedented detail on watershed health. Going down to the bottom of the page where we see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bullets, I'll just refer you to the bottom 2 bullets, which say that the work of the authority include developing policy, for example, recommending and implementing precautionary checks and balances for fisheries management based on traditional knowledge of the watershed, and also establishing protocols. And the examples they give are communicating ways to utilize traditional knowledge alongside other science in analysis and decision making. So first of all, I'd like to ask you, Ms. Reid, what your knowledge or involvement of the authority is.
My involvement was when I worked for the under the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy Program as a program officer, facilitating funding of this authority. But I didn't have direct involvement with them on an operational level.
All right, and they make note there of something that I touched on with Mr. Wang as well, which was the incorporation of Aboriginal traditional knowledge. And do you agree that First Nations traditional knowledge can have an important role to play in fisheries management?
Yes, I do.
And have you ever been directly involved in the work that you've done with any particular First Nation on incorporating traditional knowledge into habitat issues?
Yes, I have.
Can you elaborate on that, please?
When I worked as the area director in the Central Coast, I worked with the Rivers and Smiths. It was essentially a watershed planning group involving the local First Nations, Okino, the Gwasala Nakoda. Those 2 groups specifically. There may be some others. And essentially the intent of that group was to come up with a watershed fish sustainability plan for the 2 inlets, Rivers and Smiths Inlet. And certainly the incorporation of traditional ecological Aboriginal knowledge was very important into the development of that plan. That's just one example of many.
Right. Could I enter that as an exhibit, please?
Exhibit 668.
I'm now on to my final topic area, and if Mr. Bissett could please bring up tab 8 from our list of documents. And I have a few last questions now, and these will be directed at you, Mr. LeBlanc. These are minutes from a meeting that took place with the Assembly of First Nations and various other individuals, including yourself, in December 2007. It was called an AFN National Policy Analysis Group meeting. Do you remember attending that meeting, Mr. LeBlanc?
Yes, I do.
And I understand that the purpose of that meeting was to meet with First Nations from across the country and discuss policies and programs and tools that the department's Habitat branch uses, and to discuss issues of First Nations engagement and consultation and issues such as that. Do you generally agree with that?
Partly correct. This was done under the auspices of what's called the Aboriginal Inland Habitat Program that was funding the AFN to help us have a dialogue with Aboriginal peoples in the inland provinces, although they invited other people because they had their national policy group there.
All right. And as we can see, the document goes on for many pages, but in the interest of time, what we've done is summarized what we've seen in our read of it as some of the key concerns that were identified by the participants that engaged with you and others. So one of the concerns that we identified in the notes was that there was an expressed desire for consultation with First Nations to occur sooner as opposed to later in the process of regulatory approvals. And Mr. LeBlanc, are you able to indicate whether DFO has responded at all to this particular concern about early consultation?
Yes, I do believe we have, both in terms of regulatory decision-making and environmental assessment. There is a tremendous amount of guidance for staff, and I think you've heard that many of the Aboriginal groups that are near projects are may be impacted by development projects which we review are engaged in and consulted with. We've also undertaken to continue to have a dialogue with DAFN and other First Aboriginal groups across Canada on any policy development that we do. So that's part also an expansion beyond the regulatory process.
Another concern that was expressed by the First Nations participants was that what they perceived as a lack of clarity from the department about the process that's used to address First Nations concerns and the process for meaningful consultation. And I'm wondering if you can advise what, if any, steps DFO has taken to reach out to First Nations communities to explain when and how consultation is engaged and takes place, and how that fits within habitat practices and priorities. And this may be something that Mr. Wang can answer, but I'll ask Mr. LeBlanc first.
Well, I can give it a start. I think just recently we've been working through an intergovernmental group and various departments of federal governments and with INAC and other departments to develop an interim guideline for Aboriginal duty to consult. We've also integrated a lot of these things. This is a draft document that was just released a month or two ago, but it's been ongoing for quite a while. We've incorporated a lot of that practice in our own guidance documents to staff and in our training. And we have our various Aboriginal advisors in our legal department, our legal services, providing guidance and advice to us in terms of Aboriginal consultation. So I'm not sure if, Jason, you have anything to add, or others?
Just briefly, there within the operating area, we have some, what would you call them, partnership type arrangements where we do sit down on a scheduled and regular basis at tables that include First Nations to explain processes or things that are coming down the pipe project-wise, or other relevant things. There's certainly probably more wishes or demands from the First Nation communities within the interior than we have capacity to fully engage with and service, and there's certainly a very broad range of capacity and types of interest the different First Nation communities have throughout the Fraser and in fact throughout the BC interior that we deal with. So it's something that the department places a very high priority on. We do our best to address it operationally, but I would also have to acknowledge that I'd be quite certain we're not meeting everybody's expectations in that regard.
All right, and I have one last question. The other concern that we noted arising from the minutes was that there was an expressed desire for First Nations views on the importance of different habitats to be considered. And my question, and Ms. Reid answered this and Mr. Huang to a certain extent, but the question is, how does the department consider First Nations points of view, especially in relation to traditional knowledge, in respect of the importance of one habitat over another? Is there anything that any of you would like to add to what's already been said?
Well, what I'd like to add, perhaps from a slightly different angle, is through some of the integrated planning processes that we have or that we are involved in. First Nations involvement and perspectives in those planning processes are extremely important because they bring to the table their interests on a watershed level basis or an ecosystem based level, and I think that that's also very helpful to inform us for future planning processes as we go about doing our regulatory work.
What I can add is that under what's called the Aboriginal Inland Habitat Program, which doesn't cover BC, mind you, because there's a NARAM program, another one. In that one, we've provided funding to a number of Aboriginal groups to build their capacity to bring relevant information, traditional ecological knowledge, and other information into any planning and decision-making process.
Thank you. And in closing, if I could have that document marked as an exhibit, please. And those are my questions.
Exhibit 669.
Mr. Commissioner, Ms. Robertson has questions, following which if there's any re-examination, I understand Mr. Taylor has questions. I have a few. You may have questions as well.
Krista Robertson. Krista Robertson for the Mi'kmaq Tribal Council. I just have a very few questions for the panel on the application of habitat policy to salmon aquaculture sites that the Fraser River sockeye migrate near. Mr. Bissett, if you could pull up tab 1 of the Aquaculture Coalition documents. So this is the interim guide to the application of Section 35 of the Fisheries Act to marine salmonid cage aquaculture. Mr. LeBlanc, is this policy housed in the Habitat branch?
Yes, it is. It's a national guide.
Thank you. If we could just go to page 1 of the, not Roman numeral, but page 1 of the guide. The second paragraph there. If you could highlight that, please. I'm just going to paraphrase, just in the interest of time, that the purpose of this document is to aid DFO habitat management assessors in assessing whether or not a HAD could occur as a result of a salmon farm. And you'd confirm that's the purpose generally of the policy?
Yes, it is, yes.
Thank you. If we could please go to page 17 of this guide. Sorry, it's probably going to be a few other pages. It's okay, actually, thanks. If you could back up and go to page 16 there. Ms. Reid, this is a question for you. So this is a sample letter of advice that you had referred to in your earlier testimony. You mentioned with respect to 97 aquaculture sites where there was a SIA assessment that DFO made a determination that there was no HADs for those sites, but that a letter of advice was provided to Transport Canada. And this template, is that an example of that kind of letter you were referring to? It's a 2-page if you want to look at the second page.
Well, the letter we sent to to Transport Canada, this letter is intended to go to the proponent, I think. So I think it's probably a little bit different, but I'd have to compare the two.
Okay, and we'll turn to the actual letters in a moment, but I guess I'm just asking you to indicate that this letter is included in the policy as a template, as a sample letter to guide DFO assessors.
Yes.
As to what content would be in that letter of advice. And over the page, on the second page of that letter, on page 17, you can see that the signatory of the letter would be a fish habitat biologist from the fish habitat, the habitat branch.
Yes.
May I mark this document as the next exhibit, please?
So number 670.
Thank you. And now if we could pull up exhibit 663. So, Ms. Reid, these are the actual letters that you identified earlier as being the letters that were provided to Transport Canada, and this is DFO's letter of advice.
Yes.
Now, this, we haven't looked at it fully, but this document actually contains 97 letters, and they're almost identical in form, except that they pertain to different sites. Is that correct?
Yes.
So on the second page of this letter, if we could please go there, actually the third page then, I note that the signatory to this letter is Andrew Thompson, who's director of the Aquaculture Division. Could you please explain why the Aquaculture Division and not a habitat biologist or the habitat branch is providing these letters of advice to Transport Canada in respect to the environmental assessments?
I believe at the time aquaculture was still part of OHIB, so there was an organizational change, and I can't exactly remember when it was, but it might have been right around that time. So aquaculture went off to a different branch, to fisheries management at that point, but previous to that it was part of OHIB. So the director of the aquaculture program signed off on the document. We do have protocols essentially laying out who signs what, and those protocols have changed over time, so what was put in the original document may have evolved. I'd have to check the actual signing protocol.
Okay. And are you comfortable with that practice then? I mean, do you think that's appropriate that
Yes.
someone from the aquaculture branch is providing these letters of advice?
Well, this letter would have been certainly supported by a habitat biologist, somebody with the expertise necessary. So whether Andy signed it or the habitat biologist signed it, the work would have been conducted by a habitat biologist.
Okay. And is it a usual practice that 97 letters like this of the same date for 97 sites would be issued simultaneously?
I believe this is the only example of a situation like that.
Okay, thank you. My last question then is looking ahead now. After the Morton case, you're well aware, I'm sure, that DFO is now taking over the licensing of aquaculture.
Yes.
Would you expect that these letters would now have to be revised or reissued?
In fact, the process has changed because now aquaculture is considered a fishery. The way that we manage the fishery is different, and so now we have a license that's issued which covers off all provisions of that fishery, of that activity, and it also includes it identifies the types of measures needed to be in compliance with the habitat provisions. So if you look at a template of a letter, which is available on the website, you'll see how it's been set out in generalities.
So you're not expecting the DFO is going to be providing letters of advice, new letters of advice to Transport Canada in respect of SIAs that are triggered under the Navigable Waters Protection Act?
Not in the same way as we've done before. So essentially, the activity, aquaculture activity, is not going to. This part of it's not going to trigger SIA. The NWPA part may still. And as far as whether we offer advice to Transport Canada, I would suggest that we can clarify that during the aquaculture session, but I do know that aquaculture is not triggering SIA per se in this situation now.
Mr. Bissett, if we could pull up Exhibit 663, please. Is that the 97 letters? Oh. That's fine. I'll leave it at that. Those are my questions then. Thanks.
Actually, can I add something just to clarify what I think one of the questions you're asking? So while it's true that we will no longer trigger SIA under this situation, where there's an NWPA trigger, we would still offer advice to Transport Canada in that situation.
And in that situation, who then would you expect to be signing off on those letters of advice? Would you?
Well, I wouldn't characterize them as letters of advice in the way that we use them now under the Habitat program. I would expect, to tell you the truth, I'm not sure, likely either the Director of Aquaculture currently, or it could be one level down. I'm unsure who would sign them.
And the Habitat branch has no concerns about the aquaculture branch, who is mandated to promote aquaculture, as providing that advice. You don't consider that there should be some separation between the two branches in terms of providing that advice?
The aquaculture, from an organizational perspective, aquaculture is within the fisheries management program. So we still have responsibilities under the Fisheries Act. It's being done in a different way. So there's qualified people able to conduct those assessments within that aquaculture program presently. So I would say no, we don't have concerns like that.
Okay. And would the assessments then, as you were testifying earlier, in Miskwalaki's Cross, would it be still based on the 2002 policy? Meaning that only the benthic impacts would be considered in assessing a HAD?
Well, the license is far more comprehensive than that. And so if you look at a copy of a license or a template license, it has habitat pieces, but it has all the other types of questions that she was asking about, how do you consider all these other factors? Those are incorporated into the new license conditions.
All right, thank you. Those are my questions then.
Mr. Commissioner, I have 3 quick questions I hope they're quick, on re-examination. If I may proceed through those. The first, and I'll refer to Exhibit 658, and then alongside that, a new document that Mr. Bissett has up. I think we've circulated in paper format to Council this afternoon. And the question for Ms. Reid, when Exhibit 658, or indeed the new document, appears. Ms. Reid, I'll just look to see if I'm correct, if you can confirm for me that this document that Mr. Taylor took you to yesterday dates to July of 2009. And now, Mr. Bissett, if you could please bring up the document that was sent to you midday today. And our understanding is that that is the more current, and the current version there from July 2010. Is that correct?
That looks to be the case, yes.
And I'd ask to be complete that this be marked as an exhibit, please.
Exhibit number 671.
Ms. Reid, my next question deals with a point made yesterday by Mr. LeBlanc describing the HCM initiative. And as I took notes of his evidence that resulted in the gain of 23 or 24 staff, I'm wondering if you can expand on or clarify in the context of the Pacific region. First, is it correct to say that the gain for the Pacific region was 12?
I wouldn't characterize it as a gain. I would characterize it as a reallocation of staff.
Mm-hmm. And maybe you can just help me then to understand, of the reallocation of staff, did that involve staff redirected or habitat resources directed outside of habitat or away from habitat, as well as people coming in? And what was the net, I dare say, net loss or gain?
No, when the decision was taken to introduce HCM, at the same time there was expenditure review committee reductions, and so there was a bit of a shuffle in FTEs, but essentially the habitat numbers the HCM portion was taken out of those broader habitat numbers, and so that was an internal reallocation as far as I recall.
And do you know offhand the numbers that resulted in for the Pacific region?
So there was 12 HCM positions created.
Okay, and was there a number of positions or pure resources that moved outside of habitat in that context?
No, I mean, I think that what happened at the same time was we were experiencing a number of bee-based reductions, and so all at the same time we were sort of dealing with the bee-based reductions and trying to live within the available FTEs, doing this reallocation. So there was definitely a shuffle of people and FTEs, but there wasn't habitat staff sent out per se, except in order to come to our ultimate numbers, because at the time we were overstaffed.
Okay, thank you. My last point deals with Exhibit 665, and I think in our haste to try and assist Mr. Rosenblum on the documentary front, we may have put forward the wrong document under Exhibit 665. So Mr. Bissett, could you bring up that? That's the document which was marked as Exhibit 665, and we had evidence with respect to, I think, Mr. LeBlanc, you were describing a written response to the 2009 CESD, and I'm going to see if I can have another document put forward, which Mr. Bissett, I hope, has at hand. Is that the new one? Is that the right one?
That is correct.
And I wonder, in this situation, Mr. Commissioner, I would suggest it makes some sense to have this instead, just to clarify. This should be Exhibit 665 from what Mr. LeBlanc has said. I think I'd suggest this replace 665.
I'm not unless Mr. Rosenblum has some objection to that.
No objection.
All right. Very well.
Thank you.
That amendment will be made.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, I have no additional questions. Mr. Taylor indicated he had a few.
I have 3 questions. The first one relates to Exhibit 661, which is the briefing note that has come up. And this is a question of you, Mr. LeBlanc. If you go to the first sentence under background, does that succinctly explain the purpose of why you were bringing this briefing note before the Director General? In other words, that you were seeking to address raising public confidence in food safety and environmental protection in the context of aquaculture development.
That is correct.
My next question has to do with 651, which is the diagnostic, and it's a question of Ms. Reid. You were asked questions and gave evidence about the concerns that had been expressed to do with the implementation that was being done of the modernization plan, EPMP. Can you say in brief what was done as a result of the concerns expressed and where things stand now?
Yes, so I think that the end result of the diagnostic and the follow-up work that occurred, for the most part, I would say that the various elements of EPMP are successfully implemented in the region, and the level of concerns have gone down significantly.
Thank you. And my last question is of Mr. LeBlanc. There's been quite a bit of evidence about no net loss, of course, and in particular that measuring whether it has or hasn't been met generally or in specific instances is a very hard thing to do. My question is whether no net loss is a performance measure or is it something else?
It was never intended to be a performance measure. It was intended to be a guiding principle that would allow us to make decisions in terms of harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martland. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all 3 of you for making yourselves available yesterday and today again, and for your willingness to answer the questions of Council, and for your cooperation with Commission and Council. Thank you very, very much. We're adjourned until 10 tomorrow morning, is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, that's right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hearing is now adjourned until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.